Hi everyone, today we're looking at privatisation and globalisation of education. Firstly, we're going to start off by defining that term globalisation and look at the impact that it's had on the UK education system. And towards the end, we'll start to look at privatisation. And we're going to also evaluate whether these changes have been positive or negative. So firstly, what is globalisation? It's one of those terms that we hear in many subjects, but we need to be able to give a succinct definition of what it actually is. So I've put a bunch of pictures there for you to look at, and I want to see if you can come up with your own definition. So pause the video here, have a think about it, and drop down no longer than 2 or 3 lines on what it is. So the globalisation definition we could give is that it's the process by which the world is becoming increasingly interconnected as a result of massively increased trade and cultural exchange. But if we're going to talk about it in a little bit more detail, we could say that it also refers to the shrinking of the world in terms of social aspects, cultural aspects, and also in terms of the economy. We're much more interconnected. So something that can happen in one part of the world has an impact on other parts of the world, even though they might be geographically quite far away from one another. And this is due to the development of cheaper, quicker air travel, technology, and territorial boundaries perhaps breaking down. In many ways, this is a good thing because it obviously gives us more choice, more freedom, but it can have negative consequences too. So the first thing I want us to look at is this excerpt from an article from the Financial Times, and it's talking about Michael Gove sort of looking at Scandinavian schools and their education system, and he looked at their policy of introducing free schools. So they're a different type of school that has different rules compared to the schools that we have here currently, and he argued that we should introduce free schools in order to make the curriculum more flexible, to change the way teachers are paid, and to try and sort of borrow the policy really from Scandinavia. And he implemented this idea of free schools in the UK when the coalition government was in power. And to some extent they have not really made a significant impact, and arguably that it has affected more middle class families compared to working class families, as we discussed when we looked at this policy previously a few lessons ago. But that being said, I'd like you just to read the article, this excerpt from the Financial Times, and answer these 3 questions. So what does the article suggest about the influence of other countries on our policies here? Where is the UK in relation to other countries in terms of performance? So are we at the top of league tables? Are we at the bottom, etc.? What kinds of skills do you think are necessary to allow students to go on to compete with their peers in emerging global economies? So, now we're competing with students from other countries. What is it that we need to make sure that we stand out? So if you could just answer those questions here on this slide, so you can just type your answer underneath. It should fit there rather than the previous one. So next, thinking about PISA rankings, you might have heard of this, you might not have, but there's a link to a BBC article that tells you a bit more about them. But PISA essentially stands for the Programme for International Student Assessment, and it's a way in which we can rank countries in terms of their abilities in maths, reading and science against one another. So a sample of 15-year-olds are taken from each country and they sit the same test. So the tests are run by the OECD and they're taken every 3 years, and they've become quite influential in terms of influencing the decisions that policymakers and politicians make about our education system. So there's a lot of pressure now for policymakers to try and come up with policies that mean that we're going to compete and be at the top of the international league tables, not just thinking about our schools competing with one another within England. We're thinking beyond that. So how do they compare to other countries? So the UK has remained among the mid-table in terms of their performance. Singapore usually does very well, usually ranked top for more than one subject, usually for maths and science. And so there's a pressure for the UK to perhaps improve their performance. So what kind of impact, what kind of policies do you think government and policymakers are going to come up with to try and make us compete with these other countries internationally? What sort of things do you think they might try to do to secure top ranks? So policies that reflect the influence of globalisation. So there's been certain things that our governments over the years have done to, try to improve our education system and deal with the changes that globalisation has brought. So firstly, we can say there's been more of an emphasis now on lifelong learning. It used to be in the past that you would, go to school, get qualifications, and you would perhaps stay in a job for life or work for an organisation for life, or you wouldn't have that many different jobs. You wouldn't move around so much. Whereas now we're continuously moving around because, as we said, technology, travel, everything's cheaper, faster, easier, and it's very typical now for people to have multiple jobs in their life. And that means that they can't necessarily rely on the things they learned at school because they're moving around so much. But it also means that society and our world is changing so rapidly that we need to change along with it. We need to gain more skills and alternative qualifications as we go on. So that has been reflected in some of the policies perhaps different organisations have had. They might offer more training to staff once they work for them. There's been more of an emphasis on individual learning as well, so individuals competing with one another for perhaps university places, etc. The inclusion of global issues on the curriculum has expanded, so in most curriculums there is some sort of emphasis on globalisation and what influences that had, and looking at cultures from around the world. School policies focus on equality and inclusion, which arguably has been influenced by globalisation. Ofsted inspections specifically focus on whether schools have embraced diversity and whether they're teaching students about diversity. And there's been a big emphasis on EAL support. So EAL stands for English as an Additional Language. So students that perhaps have moved countries, they need support with language skills and language acquisition when they join a new country. So there's a big focus on perhaps supporting those students and employing more staff to support them. So postmodernists would go as far as arguing that the previous lessons we've done on class, gender and ethnicity are kind of invalid and they're kind of moot now. We shouldn't really be focusing on differences in class, gender and ethnicity. They argue that individual interpretation of education alongside a larger scale view of education is needed because our society is developing so rapidly. Those traditional patterns and trends that we've seen in education are starting to become less important and less significant. So there's several problems that globalisation creates. So I want you to read this text and fill in the words. So I've got a word bank at the bottom, so you just need to fill in the correct word. So essentially the problems are that students are being prepared for a work environment that we don't know what that work environment actually is or what it's going to look like. The stuff that you learn when you first join school may or may not be useful or relevant. And so it's very difficult to have things like vocational education because we don't know what technology is going to look like. It perhaps will have advanced so much by the time students leave education. So that can cause problems because how can we tailor students' skills to the workforce? We can also say that it's led to sort of rapid social change, and that means that there's perhaps been more migration in and out of the country, and this means that government perhaps finds it more challenging to ensure they have adequate school places, that they have adequate provision for students who have English as an additional language, and so that can be a bit of a problem for government too. So that was all about sort of globalisation, but the second part to this is looking at privatisation. So firstly, privatisation, well, what is it? It's where services that were provided by the state and run by the state are transferred to private companies. So some educational services might be run by a private company or a charity or even a religious institution. So the UK spends about £90 billion on education, which includes things like the salaries of staff and resources, buildings, etc. So there's quite a lot of stuff or things that can be privatised within our system. So private companies have realised this, and they are continuously trying to provide some of these services because they can make money from them. So even companies that are not based in the UK are trying to tap into the UK education market. So Pearson, for example, or Edexcel, as we might know them, they're an American company. And the 4 major software companies that we use in schools are also owned by overseas companies as well. So if you think about Edexcel or Pearson, they charge schools to enter students into exams. They provide textbooks and resources that we purchase. So there's a big market there for them to tap into and make money from us. So I've got some examples of some headlines of things that have happened, ways in which our school system has been privatised. And these really link to, well, the first one is looking at school buildings and how PFIs, or private finance initiatives, have led to perhaps private companies building schools on the behalf of government, and then they rent these back to local authorities. So the local authority will pay the company rent to use the school. So there's some information, it's in far more detail on that BBC link that I've put there. So I want you just to find out what is the Building Schools for the Future programme, who introduced it, and what were the problems with the programme. You can probably see some of the problems just from those headlines, but if you read that article in a bit more detail, it'll give you some more of problems as well. So just write the answers on this slide here, because it's got a bit more space, and then I'll be able to mark them. This activity, there is a hyperlink here to a YouTube clip, and it's a film clip that focuses on education private-public partnerships, or public-private partnerships, I should say. And it examines sort of 3 aspects. So how have private companies helped improve learning results, the governance, so how schools are run, and the accountability, so how are they being held accountable for their actions and the way in which they're running themselves. Okay, so for that one, again, just answer those questions on this slide using the clip at the top, and then I'll mark your answers. So there are several arguments for and against privatisation. So the New Right, also New Right sociologists, who we know are a branch of functionalism, they would argue that state-run education is inefficient, so how things are at the moment isn't as efficient as it could be. And they argue the state's involvement leads to a bureaucratic self-interest, the stifling of initiative and low standards. And they think that actually the whole education system should be privatised. So we looked at this ages ago when we looked at Chubb and Moe and their suggestion of a voucher system where parents are given vouchers to spend at schools. And it was really to, it's a stepping stone to privatising schools fully and us paying for them directly, because the idea is that if we are consumers that are choosing schools based on the product that they're offering, that the product will improve. So schools will have to compete with one another and improve their services in order to gain our custom, and therefore they would get better and better, and therefore standards will get better and better. So that's a New Right policy, or New Right argument. So they would say that privatisation is a good thing. So for that first one, you can just write 4 in the first box. So what I'd like you to do next is then read the other examples, the other arguments from different sociologists, and I want you to write, is it for or against privatisation, and I'll mark your answer. So we've done the first one already. Next, we've got a key concept called Cola-isation of schools. So obviously you can see there, Cola refers to Coca-Cola, the company. So this concept tries to explain, or is a concept that is about how schools are targeted specifically by private companies, because the idea is that schools, by their very nature, arguably carry goodwill and are seen as good places, and they thus confer legitimacy based on anything associated with them. So because schools are seen as good things, anything that's in the school or associated with the school will also arguably be seen as good. So I've put in bold there the name of the sociologist who said this was Molnar, so you can refer to them in your answer. So can you think of any examples relevant to our school? Are there any companies that are used in our canteen or in our ICT suites that perhaps are private companies that are providing us with services? And the reason why they're doing that is, yes, they can make money, but also because their product will be seen in a good light. Do you think this is beneficial to our schools or not? So, for example, I'm thinking about the sixth form CAF. There's, food and drink in there, isn't there, that we can buy that's branded. And so therefore, we might associate those brands with being good brands and brands that we would continue to use and buy from in the future when we leave school. So the UK spent around 110,000 in Tesco supermarkets when they had a school vouchers program. So there, like when you go to the supermarket and at the end of the when you've checked out and you've gone through the till, they give you like little vouchers, and they usually can buy things, or you can give them to schools to buy books or things like that. So in the past, Tesco did a promotion where they gave equipment vouchers for IT products, so computers, etc. Families had to spend an enormous amount just to get a single computer for school. So 110,000 had to be spent within Tesco's just to get one computer. And so this shows, how Tesco is trying to align itself with schools, trying to make itself seem like it's a good service or a good company. It's sort of caring about students and education, but really we can say it's sort of a way for them to really just gain profit. So it tells us that perhaps businesses benefit more from schools, because if you have to spend such an enormous amount just to get one computer, I'd say really the company's benefiting rather than the school. So lastly, we have to think about to what extent is privatisation a good thing, because we can see that there are good things about having privatisation and private companies offering services, but there are some negatives too. So when we're answering a question like this on an essay, because it's to what extent, we have to say to what extent. We can't just say to a certain extent. That doesn't really answer the question. We want to say to a great extent, it's a positive thing, or to a minimal extent, it's a positive thing. To a minimal degree, that's the kind of language you need to use. So all I want you to do is have a look at those questions there, those sort of prompt questions, and place yourself on this continuum. Do you think it's completely, wholly a positive thing? Is it wholly a negative thing? Or is it somewhere in between? And pick a word that would help describe where you are on that continuum. Then lastly, we're going to look at some short questions. I'm going to save the longer questions to when we're in class so that we can do them together. But have a go at these short questions for now. So outline and explain 2 effects of globalisation on education. So again, just go back through the PowerPoint, and there's different ways that you can refer to there. Or outline and explain 2 criticisms of increased privatisation of the school system. So you've got that table there that we just referred to with the for and against, so you just really need to pick out 2 things from there to discuss. So remember, for the 4-mark questions, you can use, it's 2 bullet points, but please remember that they're still full sentences, but you're really just putting them in bullet points for the benefit of the examiner, so they can see very clearly that you have referred to 2 different criticisms or 2 different effects. You might also want to refer to page 82 onwards in the textbook, so 82 to 84. That has all the information on this topic as well to help you answer those questions. So once you've done all the tasks on here, if you could save the PowerPoint and upload it to show my homework so I can mark it for you. If you have any questions, please email me. Do not leave it and think that it will just go away. You do need to do the work, so please make sure that if you're stuck, you are contacting me. Or you can contact your form tutor if you're having general problems with, accessing the internet or lack of device, etc. Thanks for listening. Take care. Bye.